Welcome to Paper Trail, where we make academic research accessible and engaging. Let's see what the evidence says.
There's a common perception that the pace of innovation is slowing down. You hear it everywhere, from think tanks to tech blogs, this idea that the low-hanging fruit has been picked and new ideas are just harder to come by.
That perception, as compelling as it sounds, turns out to be an illusion, at least according to a recent paper. What the research suggests is that ideas aren't actually getting harder to find, but rather, the effort required to find them has dramatically increased.
So it's not that people are less clever or the well is running dry, but that they're simply working a lot harder for the same or even slightly less output. That really turns the common narrative on its head.
Precisely. It's a critical distinction. The paper argues that if this exponentially increasing effort weren't being put in, the productivity slowdown observed would be far more severe, potentially even negative. The situation is essentially one of running faster just to stay in the same place.
That running faster to stay in the same place analogy is quite vivid. It's worth unpacking this idea. The general consensus, supported by macroeconomic data, is that productivity growth has indeed slowed significantly since the mid-2000s. Total factor productivity, or TFP, which measures how efficiently inputs are used, has seen a marked deceleration. How does this paper reconcile that widely accepted fact with its innovation isn't harder claim?
The paper doesn't dispute the slowdown in TFP growth. What it does, instead, is introduce a crucial missing variable, the enormous increase in research effort. The authors propose a framework where the cost of new ideas has been rising exponentially. To maintain any given rate of productivity growth, an ever larger share of resources, scientists, engineers, R&D budgets, has been needed for research and development.
So it's not that the rate of discovery per researcher has plummeted to zero, but that the overall system needs more inputs to achieve similar outputs as before. It's a distinction between the marginal productivity of an individual researcher and the aggregate innovative capacity.
Exactly. Think of it this way. If you plot the number of researchers against the rate of TFP growth, you see that while TFP growth has flattened, the number of researchers has exploded. The paper then models what TFP growth would have been without that massive increase in research effort. The finding is stark. Without the dramatic rise in R&D, TFP growth would be far lower, possibly even negative. This implies that innovation is still happening, and in significant ways, but it's becoming incredibly expensive.
One of the most compelling examples the paper highlights is Moore's Law. For decades, it's been the bedrock of technological progress, predicting that the number of transistors on a microchip would double approximately every 2 years. Many view this as almost a natural law, a given, but the paper suggests something much more active is at play.
Moore's law, while it appears as a consistent exponential trend in computing power, is not an automatic process. The paper points out that maintaining this doubling rate has required an exponentially increasing investment in research. For instance, the number of researchers required to sustain Moore's law has been doubling roughly every 1.5 years.
So the perceived naturalness of Moore's law masks a gargantuan, ever-growing effort. It's not a free lunch, it's a lunch that costs more and more to prepare each time.
Precisely. The authors estimate that the research effort behind doubling transistor density today is more than 100 times greater than it was in the early 1970s. If this effort hadn't scaled up, Moore's law would have ceased to hold true decades ago. This isn't evidence that ideas are getting harder to find per se, but that the frontier of knowledge is pushed forward by a proportionally greater mobilization of human capital and financial resources.
This isn't just about microchips, though, is it? Does the paper find similar patterns in other sectors that might seem less high-tech or research-intensive?
It does. The research extends its analysis to a couple of other critical domains: agricultural yields and medical research. Take agriculture, for example. Incredible gains in crop yields have been seen over the last century, feeding a rapidly growing global population. However, the rate of increase in yields per researcher has slowed significantly.
So to get that next percentage point of yield improvement, more plant geneticists, more agronomists, and more sophisticated lab work are needed.
Exactly. The low-hanging fruit of basic hybridization or simple crop rotation might have been picked, but advanced genomic sequencing, precision agriculture, and complex agroecological systems require enormous, coordinated research efforts. The gains are still there, and they're crucial for food security, but the cost in terms of research input has climbed. The same pattern holds in medicine. The discovery of penicillin was a landmark, relatively straightforward achievement in its time. Now, developing a new drug involves decades of research, massive clinical trials, and multi-billion-dollar investments.
That's a powerful point. The low-hanging fruit metaphor often implies a finite number of easy discoveries, after which everything becomes exponentially harder. But what the paper seems to be saying is that even if the fruit is higher up, longer ladders, better fruit picking machines, and exponentially more pickers have been developed and deployed to get it.
That's a good way to frame it. The question isn't whether the fruit exists, but at what cost it can be reached. The paper's central argument is that the observation of slowing productivity growth, when viewed alongside the massive increase in research effort, suggests that the underlying difficulty of innovation hasn't necessarily changed. What has changed is the resource intensity required to maintain or even slightly reduce the pace of progress. It challenges the inherent pessimism of the ideas are getting harder to find narrative by pointing to the sheer scale of effort being exerted.
Regarding the methodology, how did the researchers actually quantify this cost of new ideas and separate it from raw TFP growth? What was their identification strategy to make this claim?
They developed a structural model that connects research effort, measured by the number of researchers, to TFP growth. The core of their approach involves estimating a parameter that captures how many researchers are needed to produce a given amount of TFP growth. This parameter allows them to essentially back-calculate what TFP growth would have been if the number of researchers had remained constant or grown at a slower rate.
So they're essentially creating a counterfactual scenario. They're asking if R&D departments and scientific communities hadn't scaled up to this unprecedented degree, where would the economy be?
That's right. By doing so, they found a very robust pattern. The number of researchers required to generate a constant rate of TFP growth has been rising exponentially. This implies that the research productivity, the TFP growth generated per researcher, has been falling significantly. However, because the total number of researchers has grown even faster, the overall TFP growth has been maintained, albeit at a slower rate than in previous golden ages of innovation.
And that's where the illusion comes in, because the research effort is not typically held constant when TFP numbers are examined. Only the output side is usually seen.
Exactly. The illusion stems from comparing today's TFP growth rates with those of the past without accounting for the vastly different inputs of research effort. When you factor in the sheer volume of human capital and financial resources now dedicated to R&D, what looks like a slowdown is actually a testament to sustained effort, preventing an even more dramatic decline.
So if the cost of new ideas is rising exponentially, what are the implications? Does this mean society is trapped on a treadmill where more and more resources have to be poured into research just to stay afloat? Or does the paper offer any solutions or policy implications?
The paper doesn't necessarily offer policy prescriptions in terms of how to make research cheaper. Instead, its primary implication is that more research is needed, not less. The authors argue that the observed slowdown in productivity growth would be far worse without the massive increase in research effort that has already occurred. Therefore, reducing research investment would be catastrophic for future growth.
That's a powerful warning. It suggests that if the current pace of progress is to be maintained, let alone accelerated, ways need to be found to sustain or even increase this exponentially rising research investment. It's not a question of whether innovation is possible, but whether it can be afforded.
It's a reminder that economic growth and improved living standards are not inevitable. They are the result of conscious, sustained, and increasingly costly investments in knowledge creation. The paper highlights that humanity's ability to innovate is not exhausted, but rather the process is becoming more resource-intensive, requiring a continuous push of the boundaries of what's possible, even if it feels like more effort is required for each marginal gain.
The research offers several key insights. First, the perceived slowdown in innovation isn't due to ideas being inherently harder to find, but rather the exponentially increasing resources required to discover them.
Second, the cost of new ideas has risen dramatically across sectors, from microchips to medicine, meaning significantly more researchers and R&D investment are needed to achieve the same rate of progress as in the past.
And third, without this sustained and growing investment in research, the productivity slowdown observed would be far more severe, underscoring the critical role of R&D in maintaining economic growth.
Ultimately, the paper presents a challenge. How can research efforts continue to be scaled in a way that sustains innovation, given that the returns per individual researcher appear to be diminishing? And what does this mean for how scientific discovery is structured and funded in the decades to come?
That wraps up this episode of Paper Trail. Join us next time as we dig into more research worth talking about. If you liked what you heard, share it with a friend.
Keep reading the fine print.